Bloodborne, the Red Death, an unmasking, created for the stage by the Mudlark Public Theater. Honored guests, be welcome and be wary. Our most esteemed master, host, and author has taken greatest pains to make ultimate use of our tireless ministrations, nearly invisible, yet highly legible. We linger in the shadows, ever ready to assist with your costume, lay your place at table, provide succor within this, your exile, in fevered enchantment.
Jane, with anticipation of your every need, we are your shadow.
In perfect realization of our master magician's fantasy, you will bear witness to a self-wrought reckoning. This is a feast to give voice to the unspoken. This is a carnival of color. Ironclad servitude has forged our ultimate purpose, and we are tasked to cultivate your indulgence. What savage heart our Lord has mechanized in our still living breast, tell tale, and blood will out.
But where to begin, dear author? Your shadow creatures seek an introduction.
We are all at sea.
In the beginning there is void, and a primal cry from the depths of the cave, from the belly of a groaning boat. A vessel, gorged with living blood, swells for understanding.
A benediction begged for the blind, as we are transported, rewritten in your language.
Psalm 101. De profundis clamaviate Domine. Out of the depths I have cried to thee, O Lord.
Less than zero. Seascape. There blooms a thorny compass rose. Writ in the Occidental language of blood, on nobility.
Holy Mother Church,
nobility of the blood is a powerful stimulus for the practice of virtue.
The splendor of the blood and the virtue of the ancestors, true Christians and direct descendants of the Holy Mother, have a marvelous effect in disposing the nobleman to follow in the footsteps of those from whom he descended.
His blood is a kind of bridle that represses vices and actions unbecoming of a noble. Should the noble fall into some fault, this causes him to be overcome with the greatest shame, and he takes care to purify himself of this stain.
On servitude. An understanding of servitude is inextricable from a comprehension of stains. A tinctus, a taint, a tainder. Corruption of the blood. According to 16th century English law, the blood of the felon has become tainted or corrupted by his crime, so that he and his descendants lose all rights of rank and title. The law sets a note of infamy upon him, puts him out of its protection, and takes no further care of him. He is then called a taint, a tinctus, stained, or blackened. In the grim work of colonization, this taint is transmitted to the body and being of the indentured servant, and ultimately the slave. These are diagnosed as criminal by the contagion of captivity, of bloodborne blackness.
The State. Virginia Slave Code, 1662. Children born in the colony to enslaved mothers will take the social status of their mothers, regardless of whomsoever their fathers may be.
The result is generation after generation of enslaved persons, including mixed-race children and adults, many of whom were born of white fathers. Corruption of blood, dauntless infection, had evolved and now is transmitted not by the sins of the father, but through the misfortunes of the mothers. The presentation of color in the flesh can no longer be trusted as a legible marker. All blood runs red, yet must be taught to speak the language of bondage.
And what of you, dear author, according to the minds of your time?
Successful enslavement of another human being demands the fusion of the slave's identity with that of his master.
We, once princes, now servants, cannot take our life but to question your beginnings.
1809. You are born of steamer trunk to a pair of actors, one English, one Irish. Both brought by boat to the New World harbor of Boston. American son. Shakespeare's King Lear was the play that brought them together, and they dubbed you Edgar, after the legitimate heir to a throne that makes madmen of bastards. Bitter irony, this Edgar, as your father within a year abandons his young and their mother, with nothing but the stain of Poe to finish your names. Paterfamilias, missing, presumed dead, 1810. Your mother, she promises as you fuss.
Tush now, I'll always be with you.
And your infant's eyes watch as your mother drowns in her own blood from the consumption. Red roses in her cheeks and rubies in her sputum, as her waxen hands go livid blue and must relinquish your care to distant keepers. The Red Death, your first foster, and you are an orphan in exile.
Little prince, separated from your siblings, you travel south through first tempest and are washed up on the rushy shores of Virginia, reborn, now a son of the Allen family. These Allens deal in a variety of trades, including tobacco, textile, tombstones, and slaves. From the pallid clutch of death, you are remitted to the tender embrace of willowy brown limbs. At this dark bosom, you will lap work sweat, stifle tears, and the lullabies of exile. And she promises as you fuss.
Tush now, I'll always be with you.
Until she is sold.
This song, not as she sang it, but as you remember, larval Shakespeare, the mother tongue of servitude, is forever beyond your ken.
Tush now, I'll always be with you.
Until she is sold.
Hark, hark, the watchdogs bark. Hark, hark, the watchdogs bark.
And you grow, fostered with fawning and cruelty in equal measure. You try your hand at cutting cards. You are dealt debt and scholarship, debt and military service. But above all, you are a writer. The bitter gall of liquor and a gambler's burden finds you unseated. You are called vulgar. But above all, you are a writer. Your first poetry is born.
Imitation, a dream within a dream, a dark, unfathomed tide of interminable pride, a mystery and a dream, should my early life seem.
1830. Taken up as a literary critic, you remark on the burning issue of the day, but always in supportive quotation of your like-minded fellows.
The elegant Anne McIver Grant.
I have nowhere met with instances of friendship more tender and generous than that which here subsisted between the slaves and their masters and mistresses. Slave children were never sold without consulting their mothers. Come into these yellow sands and then take hands.
Your beloved Virginia, 1831.
Nat Turner.
A slave and self-made mystical preacher leads a 2-day rebellion. 50 slavers and unnumbered rebels lay dead in crimson riptide. This insurrection prompted the first and last concerted effort by a slave state to abolish slavery within its borders. Crushed by a mass public hanging.
Professor and 13th President of William and Mary College, Thomas Ardou, opposed this measure in the following.
It is well known that Nat Turner, a fanatical Negro preacher, rose in the night in County Southampton, Virginia, and murdered a vast number of unsuspecting whites of that county, striking fear into the heart of every slaveholder. The imagination was forced to conjure up the most appalling of phantoms, when the overwhelming number of blacks would rise, superior to all restraint, and involve the fairer portion of our land in ruin and desolation. A merrier being does not exist on the globe but that of the Negro slave. When then, since the slave is happy, should we endeavor to disturb his contentment by infusing into his mind the vain and indefinite desire for liberty? a something which he perhaps cannot comprehend, and which must inevitably dry up the very source of his happiness?
Slaves and their supporters are forbidden from mass assembly. We assembled dear guests are treading on dangerous ground. And you, our authors, say?
To the talents and great acquirements of Professor Dew, it is quite unnecessary to speak. To his work is especially due the high political character of Virginia.
We, the unseen, bear witness to you, dear author. Maker, we see you. Though shadow lurking behind praise of your fellows, we, versed by your hand, in your language, read your adulation and your assent to our lot. Courtship, a tea dance.
You are love-struck author, wed your first cousin, aged 13. You two are of the same blood, and your heart cries out to hold her. She, same age as tragic Juliet, and you do devour your Shakespeare.
This child, named Virginia, holy virgin and namesake of your beloved southern state, a tempest in a teapot, she. One evening in January 1842, Virginia shows the first signs of the consumption. Just as your blood mother and she, pedestal entertainer too, singing and playing the pianoforte, breaks a blood vessel in her throat. The ebony chords of her song dampening dark with the ruptured cords and the ivory neck of this lily. Your virgin child bride, only partially recovered, yet she promises.
Tush now, I'll always be with you.
And you drown yourself, drop by drop, as she is swallowed inwardly by the tides of the Red Death.
Useless stuff will not endure.
And now we, shipwrecked, have nearly arrived at the tale. You, despiser of plagiarists and condemner of stylistic derivations, are dubbed Tomahawk Man in editorial circles for the exacting savagery of the literary criticism you lob against your fellows.
But we thinks our author doth protest too much. We, creatures of your imaginings, have here arrived by virtue of The Tempest by Shakespeare. And you, romantic cryptographer, could not help but infest the bard's enchanted island in your sickness.
Shakespeare's The Tempest,
A cakewalk enacted by invisible servants.
Prospero, scholar of sorcery and rightful Duke of Milan, is usurped by his younger brother and cast to sea with his toddling, motherless daughter, Miranda. Within her name the mirror, admired, looked upon. They are wrecked on foreign shores. Prospero wields his texts of magic and makes quick slaves of the island's only anthropomorphic inhabitants. Ariel, an elemental fixture of the wind, loosed by magic from the belly of a tree. And dark Caliban, tidal witch babe of the sea-swept earthen shore. Prospero is instructed in the ways of the island by Black Caliban, native son and prince. And in exchange, Prospero shackles Caliban in his invasive language. Prospero, as we, the enshackled, read it through said language, is deeply enamored of his own blossoming child. In his self-reflecting horror, he ascribes to Caliban all the features and fears of his own darkness, accuses Caliban of attempting the ripening virgin's defilement. And then, in a tidal shift, the mage turned prospector deems Caliban slave and monster. Monster. Latin root monere, to warn. The black slave is a portent, a menace, the specter of death. Caliban is, in the sense of the word by which he is constantly known, a living threat, crying from his sea cave prison. You taught me language, and my profit on't is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language. Caliban, named the Red Death. There pass 12 long years, and Prospero sets into motion a sorcerial sea change that will yield his reckoning with enmity and seal an end to his magic. 0. Windswept exterior of a castellated abbey. A mission built from the fortified wreckage of a shipwrecked vessel. At long and seasick last, we have arrived at the tale as you would have it. O author, we entreat you now to speak.
Psalm 142. Domine, exaudio ratione meam, oribus percipe obsecratione meam in veritate tua.
Hear, O Lord, my prayer. Give ear to my supplication in thy truth.
The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, 1842. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then the profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow man. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of a half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulse of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think.
External? Take care of itself? But what of the internal world? We, who lay the table and empty your excretions, are subsumed as invisible servants. What are our names? And you dare crib lines from the bard?
The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. Let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite.
And you dare crib lines from the bard?
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages.
We, who maintain these colored chambers, bear witness to your deadly sins, viewed from corners and keyholes. The chambers, 7. 1. Blue. The sin, exegia, sloth.
The infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms.
Pure blue, also known as high blue, is not mixed with any other colors. Born in the 11th century, the Spanish term sangre de azul, blue blood, muñecas blancas que no trabajan en el sol, pale dolls who had never worked in the sun and never interbred with Jews or Moors. In Latin, lividus, lividity, the color of corpses. Ultramarine, of the Holy Virgin's robes in her unattainable heaven.
And to this bedsore we, of the black and blue color, offer our virtue, vigilantia, vigilance.
Chamber 2, purple. The vice, avaritia, avarice.
And then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like a snail, unwillingly to school.
Tyrian purple, petulant prince who will not share. The process of making this purple dye is long, difficult, and expensive. Thousands of snails had to be found, their shells cracked, the snail removed. Mountains of empty shells have been found at the ancient site of Tyre. The snails were left to soak, then a tiny gland was removed and the juice extracted and put in a basin, which was placed in sunlight. There, a remarkable transformation took place. The process had to be stopped at exactly the right time to obtain the desired color, which could range from the bright crimson to a darkest purple, the color of dried blood. Born to the purple, is to be born into a life of wealth and privilege.
And in our meticulous ministrations to the mollusk, we recognize the virtue of eleemosina, bounty.
Chamber 3. Green. Invidia. Envy.
And then the lover, sighing like a furnace with a woeful ballad, made to his mistress's eyebrow.
Verdus. Verdant. The color of growth, youth, and wealth. The color of Venus, goddess of love and gardens. Shakespeare's venom-tongued servant warns his murderous master Othello, the Moor.
Beware of jealousy, my lord, for it is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on.
And to this toxic gall, we green-skinned captives offer caritas, love unconditional.
4. Orange. Gula. Gluttony.
Then a soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation, even in the cannon's mouth.
Portuguese merchants brought the first orange trees to Europe from Asia in the late 15th century, along with the Sanskrit naranga, naranja in Spanish, orange in English. Saffron robes of goddess Pomona, a fruitful abundance, a word disseverable from taste, ripeness, the Epicurean, spices, the Hindu, exotic native, the tiger.
To quell your bottomless appetite, we, the orange-clad famished, offer abstentia, abstinence. May our self-denial find you filled.
5. White. The sin. Superbia. Pride.
And then the justice, and fair round belly with good capon lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances.
Purity. Perfection. Let he who is without sin. The white unicorn, symbol of purity, chastity, and grace, which could only be captured by a virgin. From the birth of your church, interiors seem to be alive, filled with curves, asymmetry, mirrors, gilding, statuary, and reliefs, unified by white. Men and women alike, in powdered white wigs and white stockings, the universal color of underwear and sheets. When linen was worn out, it was collected and turned into high-quality paper. Delicate throats, unblemished skin, leaden mask of the heavily painted face.
White is the color most associated with cleanliness. We are the parchment heavily inked in black. We, those which are expected to be clean, into clean. And in our imperfection, we present to your overstudied mirror humilitas, humility.
And so he plays his part.
6. Violet. Luxuria. Lust.
The 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose, well saved, a world too wide, for his shrunk shank, and his big manly voice, turning again toward childish treble, pipes, and whistles in his sound.
From the Old French, violette, and from the Latin viola, the names of a violet flower. French purple, as in French letters, are synonymous with the pornographic. This is an ostentatious and genital color. Violet pigment was developed in France. A lichen is extracted by urine or ammonia. Famed lesbianic poet Sappho describes a lost love wearing a garland of violet tiaras twined around her neck.
Even as we watch you rut in our bondage of spirit and flesh, the servant is a soul of castitas, chastity.
And at last the revel reaches the seventh chamber, belly of the slave ship and secret keep of your imprisoned wildling, black and blood-colored, Ira, wrath.
Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything.
The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Ghastly in the extreme, this produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those that entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony.
The virtue to wrath's vice is patientia, patience. We servants, imagined as your ebony clock this, dear Lord, inventor, present our telltale, ticking as a condemnation, and blood will out.
The clock's pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud, and deep, and exceedingly musical.
Our voice cries out from the depths of the black cavern.
The musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause in their performance, to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And, while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale. And thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled.
We are stalking you by the hour.
There were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence, having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise. Then, finally, of terror, of horror, and of disgust. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse, which with a slow and solemn movement stalked to and fro among the waltzers. The mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, his brow reddened with rage.
In our black heart is born your wrath.
Who dares? Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements.
It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, the intruder, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. There were found none who put forth hand to seize the intruder so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way, uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first. Through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him.
It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger. The cloaked figure, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterwards, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and, seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night.
Tush, didn't I say I'd always be with you?
At last, we are called by our name, your black shadow realized in vivid color, and by your own hand.
And one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired. And the darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
We, once servants, are reborn princes of this shattered fantasy.
Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have, my own, which is most faint. Now 'tis true, I must be here confined by you. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free.